History is full of stories we've all heard, repeated in classrooms, movies, and everyday conversations. But what if many of those so-called facts were never true in the first place? From tales of Vikings and horned helmets, to the idea that Napoleon was unusually short, to myths about the pyramids being built by slaves. Our past is filled with legends that have shaped how we see history, but don't hold up under closer examination. In this first part of our series, we'll uncover 30 of the biggest historical lies and myths that people still believe. By the time you reach the end, you'll see how propaganda, misunderstandings, and simple exaggeration have rewritten entire chapters of history. And remember, this is just the beginning. There are 70 more myths waiting in the next parts of this series. 1. Napoleon was short. The image of Napoleon Bonaparte as a tiny man, forever compensating for his lack of height, has been repeated for centuries. School children are taught about the so-called Napoleon complex, suggesting that his hunger for conquest was fueled by insecurity over his stature. But the truth is far more mundane. When Napoleon died in 1821, his height was recorded as 5 feet 2 inches, but this measurement was in French feet. Converted to English feet and inches, Napoleon stood around 5 feet 6 or 5 feet 7, perfectly average, even slightly above average for a Frenchman of his time. So why the myth? British propaganda played a huge role. During the Napoleonic Wars, cartoonists and satirists often portrayed him as a tiny, angry man to mock him and diminish his power in the eyes of the public. These images were powerful, and they stuck. Even after his death, his enemies ensured this caricature endured. Today, the myth persists because it makes for a simple story. The small man who sought to conquer Europe. Reality is far less amusing. Napoleon wasn't short at all. He was average, but propaganda reshaped him forever. 2. Vikings wore horned helmets. Ask anyone to describe a Viking, and the chances are they'll mention horned helmets. This iconic image is splashed across films, comics, and sports mascots. But archaeologists know it's simply untrue. No Viking helmet with horns has ever been found in excavation sites. In fact, practical warriors like the Vikings would never have worn such cumbersome headgear in combat. Horns could be grabbed or deflected, making them a disadvantage in battle. So where did this image come from? In the 19th century, an opera costume designer named Carl Emil Doppler dressed his Viking characters in horned helmets for Richard Wagner's operas. The image caught on, particularly in popular culture and art. The romantic 19th century loved to exaggerate the wildness of ancient peoples, and the horned Viking fit perfectly. Today, we still imagine them with horns because the image is so visually striking. The truth that Vikings wore simple, functional helmets, or sometimes none at all, just doesn't have the same dramatic appeal. 3. The Great Wall of China is visible from space. For decades, children were taught that the Great Wall of China was the only man-made object visible from the moon. It's a fascinating idea, a structure so immense it can be seen from outer space. But astronauts have repeatedly debunked this claim. From low Earth orbit, the wall is very difficult to spot with the naked eye. It blends into the landscape, built from local stone and earth that match the surrounding terrain. From the moon, it is utterly impossible to see. Human-made lights, highways, airports, and entire cities are far more visible from space than the Great Wall. The myth probably started with exaggerated descriptions in books during the 20th century and then found its way into school textbooks. The persistence of the myth lies in its symbolic appeal. The idea of an ancient civilization building something so vast it can be seen from space. The reality is that the wall is impressive enough without needing cosmic exaggeration. 4. Medieval people thought the Earth was flat. We are often told that Christopher Columbus bravely sailed west to prove the Earth was round, while everyone else thought it was flat. This is completely false. Educated people in the Middle Ages already knew the Earth was a sphere. The knowledge came from ancient Greek scholars like Pythagoras, Aristotle, and Eratosthenes, whose works survived through translations. The real debate Columbus faced wasn't about the Earth's shape, but its size. Most scholars believed the Earth was larger than Columbus claimed, and they were right. If the Americas hadn't been there, his fleet might never have survived the journey. The myth of flat Earth medievals was invented later in the 19th century by writers such as Washington Irving, who wanted to dramatize Columbus's story. It made for a good narrative, the lone visionary against ignorant tradition. But history shows that medieval scholars were not so backward. The myth survives because it flatters our modern sense of progress, letting us look down on the so-called Dark Ages. 5. Salem witches were burned at the stake. When people hear about the Salem witch trials of 1692, they often imagine witches tied to wooden stakes, flames rising around them. But no one in Salem was burned. 19 accused witches were hanged, and one man, Giles Corey, was crushed to death with heavy stones for refusing to enter a plea. Burning at the stake was more common in European witch trials, not in colonial America. The confusion comes from mixing these histories together. The Salem trials were brutal enough without fire. Hysteria, false accusations, and fear of the devil led to innocent people dying. The persistence of the myth, burning, probably comes from its dramatic imagery. Fire has long been associated with purification, hell, and witchcraft in popular imagination. Films and literature also spread this version of events because it is visually powerful. The truth, however, is that the tragedy of Salem was rooted in paranoia, injustice, and human cruelty, not fire. 6. Einstein failed math in school. Albert Einstein is remembered as one of the greatest scientific minds in history. Yet a stubborn math claims he struggled with mathematics as a child, even failing it. This is entirely untrue. Einstein was an excellent student in math from a young age. By age 15, he had mastered calculus. The myth probably started from a misunderstanding of the Swiss grading system, where low numbers meant high scores, confusing later readers. Another origin comes from Einstein failing the entrance exam to the Zurich Polytechnic on his first try, but he failed the non-math sections, not mathematics itself. He was accepted the following year. The story has survived because it is inspirational. The idea that even a genius once failed gives hope to struggling students. But the reality is that Einstein's mathematical talent was always exceptional. His difficulties lay more in dealing with authority and rigid school systems than in understanding numbers. 7. The Dark Ages were a time of stagnation. The term Dark Ages conjures images of 1,000 years of ignorance, violence, and no progress between the fall of Rome and the Renaissance. Modern historians reject this label. While the early medieval period was a time of political upheaval and population decline, it was also an era of innovation. Farmers developed new tools like the heavy plow and horse collar, which transformed agriculture. Windmills and water mills became common. Monks preserved ancient manuscripts, copying texts that would have otherwise been lost. Universities began in the High Middle Ages, laying the groundwork for modern science. Architecture flourished, producing Gothic cathedrals of breathtaking beauty. The myth of the Dark Ages was popularized during the Renaissance and Enlightenment, when scholars wanted to portray their own era as a rebirth after centuries of ignorance. The term stuck, but it is misleading. The Middle Ages were not dark. They were complex, filled with both challenges and achievements. Number 8. Marie Antoinette said, "Let them eat cake." Few lines in history have been used to symbolize royal arrogance more than "let them eat cake." Supposedly uttered by Queen Marie Antoinette during a famine in France, the phrase has echoed through history as proof of her callousness. But she never said it. The line first appeared in Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Confessions, written in 1765, when Marie Antoinette was only 9 years old and living in Austria. Historians believe it was likely a rumor spread to fuel hatred of the queen during the French Revolution. Marie Antoinette was unpopular for many reasons: her foreign birth, lavish spending, and perceived indifference to the common people. The phrase was perfect propaganda, easy to repeat and dripping with disdain. Over time, it became fixed in popular culture. Today, it remains one of the most famous quotes she never said, a reminder of how powerful words can be when weaponized, even if they are false. 9. George Washington had wooden teeth. America's first president is often remembered for his supposed wooden dentures, but George Washington never had wooden teeth. He did suffer terribly from dental problems, losing most of his teeth by the time he became president. His dentures were made from ivory, gold, lead, and even human and animal teeth. Some of these materials stained and cracked over time, giving the appearance of wood, which may explain the myth. The truth reveals something more uncomfortable. Dentistry in the 18th century often relied on teeth purchased from the poor, and in some cases, enslaved people. Washington himself bought human teeth to use in his dentures. The wooden teeth myth has endured because it is easier to tell children than the darker reality. It also makes Washington seem more human, a great man with simple, almost comical flaws. The real story, however, is far more complex and morally troubling. 10. Gladiators always fought to the death. Movies and novels have taught us that Roman gladiators fought until one was killed, with the crowd baying for blood and the emperor giving the fatal thumbs down. In truth, most gladiatorial matches did not end in death. Gladiators were expensive investments, trained professionals owned by wealthy sponsors. To lose one in every fight would have been economically wasteful. Fights often ended when one gladiator was seriously wounded or surrendered. While some matches were deadly, especially in the earlier republic, by the imperial era, rules and referees often kept combat from being fatal. As for the famous thumbs down, historians now believe the gesture may not have meant death at all, but rather mercy. The myth of constant bloodshed comes from modern retellings, which love the spectacle of death. The reality was brutal enough, men forced to fight for entertainment, but not always the slaughter we imagine. 11. Thomas Edison invented the light bulb. The name Thomas Edison is nearly synonymous with the invention of the light bulb. Generations of students have been taught that this single genius lit up the world. But Edison did not invent the light bulb. What he did was improve upon existing designs and make them commercially viable. Long before Edison, British inventors like Humphrey Davy, Warren de la Rue, and Joseph Swan had already created early versions of incandescent lamps. The problem was that these bulbs were inefficient, expensive, and burned out quickly. Edison's true achievement was persistence, testing thousands of materials for filaments until he found one that was durable and practical. His 1879 bulb could burn for over 1,200 hours, which was revolutionary for the time. Edison also developed the infrastructure of electricity, generators, wiring, and power stations, making his version of the light bulb practical for homes and cities. The myth that he invented it persists because history loves simple stories. A single genius inventor is easier to remember than a web of contributors. In truth, Edison stood on the shoulders of many who came before him, and his success was as much about business and marketing as invention. 12. The Trojan Horse was a real event exactly as told. The tale of the Trojan Horse, immortalized in Homer's epics, describes how the Greeks ended the Trojan War. Unable to breach Troy's walls, they supposedly built a giant wooden horse, hid soldiers inside, and tricked the Trojans into bringing it into their city. At night, the soldiers emerged, opened the gates, and Troy fell. It's one of the most famous stories in history, but did it happen? Archaeologists have found evidence of a great city at Troy, destroyed around 1200 BCE, so there was indeed a conflict. But the horse? Most historians think it was symbolic, not literal. Some suggest the horse may have been a battering ram or siege engine, nicknamed after Poseidon's sacred animal, the horse. Others believe it may have been a metaphor for an earthquake, also associated with Poseidon, that destroyed Troy's walls. The wooden horse as we know it was likely a later embellishment. Why does the myth endure? Because it's dramatic, clever, and embodies the idea of deceptive genius. The Trojan horse became a symbol for trickery and hidden danger, and that simple, powerful image has survived long after the real details of Troy's fall were lost. 13. Nero played the fiddle while Rome burned. Emperor Nero's reign is remembered for tyranny, decadence, and most famously for the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE. According to legend, Nero stood on a tower playing the fiddle while flames consumed the city. This image paints him as cruel and indifferent. But the truth is far murkier. First, the fiddle did not even exist in Nero's time. The violin family of instruments would not appear for another 1400 years. Nero did play the lyre, a stringed instrument, but whether he did so during the fire is uncertain. Roman historians like Tacitus note that Nero was not in Rome when the fire started. He returned quickly and even organized relief efforts, opening his gardens to shelter the homeless. However, Nero later used the disaster to build his lavish palace complex, the Domus Aurea, and he did blame Christians for the fire, leading to brutal persecutions. The myth of him fiddling while Rome burned may have been political slander cemented by later historians who despised him. Today it endures because it captures the idea of a leader's neglect, a metaphor for rulers who ignore their people's suffering. 14. Women were absent from warfare in history. Traditional history books often portray war as a male domain, with women relegated to domestic roles. But women have been warriors across many cultures and eras. From the Scythians of Central Asia, where archaeology reveals female skeletons buried with weapons, to the Dahomey Amazons of West Africa, who fought as an elite military corps, history is full of female fighters. Even in Europe, figures like Joan of Arc led armies and inspired nations. In Japan, Onna-Bugashiya women of the samurai class trained with weapons like the naginata and defended their homes. During both world wars, women not only worked in factories but also served as snipers, pilots, and resistance fighters. The myth of women's absence comes largely from male historians of earlier centuries who downplayed or ignored their roles, preferring a narrative of male heroism. It persists because modern popular culture often repeats the same stereotypes. But archaeology and scholarship increasingly uncover evidence that women were present on battlefields, not as rare exceptions, but as significant participants. The truth disrupts a comfortable narrative, but it shows that human history of war is more diverse than often assumed. 15. The Emancipation Proclamation freed all slaves instantly. On January 1, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all slaves in Confederate states shall be thenceforward, and forever free. Many people assume this instantly ended slavery in the United States, but the reality is more complicated. The proclamation applied only to states in rebellion against the Union, meaning it did not free slaves in border states like Kentucky, Missouri, or parts of Louisiana that were under Union control. In practice, it freed no one immediately because the Union Army had to physically advance and enforce it. Freedom came gradually as Union troops captured territory. Full abolition of slavery did not come until the passage of the 13th Amendment in December 1865 after the Civil War had ended. So why does the myth persist? Because the proclamation was a turning point, giving the Union moral clarity and aligning the war with the cause of human freedom. It is remembered as a single dramatic act, when in truth, emancipation was a process, fought for by enslaved people themselves as much as by any proclamation. 16. Spartans threw weak babies off cliffs. The image of ancient Sparta as a ruthless society that inspected newborns and hurled weak or deformed babies off a cliff has circulated for centuries. Ancient writers like Plutarch described this practice, and modern culture, from textbooks to films like 300, has repeated it. But archaeological evidence tells a different story. Excavations at the site of the supposed cliff, Mount Tegetus, found no remains of infants, only adult skeletons. Historians now believe that while Spartans may have practiced a form of selective upbringing, the idea of systematic infanticide is exaggerated. More likely, Weak or sickly babies were left to die of exposure, as in many ancient societies, rather than being thrown dramatically from cliffs. The myth likely grew from outsiders' fascination with Sparta's harsh militaristic culture, portraying them as the ultimate warriors who valued strength above all. It persists today because it fits neatly into our image of Sparta as brutal, uncompromising, and alien compared to other Greek states. The reality was harsh, but not quite the theatrical cruelty the myth suggests. 17. The Library of Alexandria was burned once and all knowledge was lost. The burning of the Library of Alexandria is one of history's most famous tragedies, a single night when flames supposedly consumed the greatest collection of knowledge in the ancient world. But reality is more complex. The library suffered multiple incidents over centuries, not one catastrophic fire. Julius Caesar's siege of Alexandria in 48 BCE likely damaged part of it. Later, attacks by Emperor Aurelian and eventual decrees under Theodosius and later rulers may have contributed to its decline. There was no single event that erased it. Moreover, while it housed vast collections, knowledge was not lost entirely. Many works survived in other libraries across the Mediterranean and Middle East. The myth of a single devastating fire survives because it is dramatic, offering a simple story of civilization losing priceless wisdom in one act of destruction. The truth that knowledge eroded gradually through neglect, politics, and shifting priorities is less cinematic, yet it reminds us that cultural loss is often a slow process, not a single catastrophe. 18. The American Revolution was fought solely over taxes. The cry of no taxation without representation is remembered as the rallying call of the American Revolution. This has led to a widespread belief that the war was simply about taxes. In reality, taxation was only one part of a larger struggle over political rights, self-government, and identity. Colonists objected to the British Parliament's authority to govern them without representation, which extended beyond taxes to laws restricting trade, settlement, and local decision-making. The revolution was also fueled by Enlightenment ideals about liberty and natural rights, as well as by practical concerns like land, westward expansion, and resentment of standing armies stationed in the colonies. Taxes like the Stamp Act and Tea Act were sparks, but they represented something deeper, a question of who held ultimate authority. The myth of a tax revolt persists because it's simple, easy to teach, and ties into everyday frustration with taxes. But the revolution was far more complex, rooted in ideas of sovereignty and independence.
19. Medieval knights were always noble and chivalrous. Stories of medieval knights often paint them as paragons of honor, following strict codes of chivalry, defending the weak, and fighting for noble causes. But the reality was often different. Many knights were essentially heavily armed thugs, engaging in brutal wars, raiding villages, and exploiting peasants. Chivalry was more an ideal promoted by the church and nobility than a widespread practice. Even tournaments, often romanticized, could be violent affairs, more about wealth and prestige than honor. During the Crusades, knights committed massacres as often as they defended pilgrims. The myth of noble knights comes from medieval romances and later Victorian reinterpretations, where writers like Sir Walter Scott cast knights as heroes. Today, movies and literature continue the romanticized version, ignoring the darker side of medieval warfare. The truth is that knights were products of their violent age, sometimes capable of loyalty and bravery, but often motivated by power and plunder. 20. The first Thanksgiving was a peaceful, harmonious feast. The story of the first Thanksgiving in 1621 describes pilgrims and Native Americans sitting together in harmony, sharing a meal of turkey, corn, and gratitude. This image is taught in schools and celebrated in art, but the truth was more complicated. The feast did happen, but it was not an annual tradition at the time, nor was it purely about friendship. The Pilgrims were celebrating their harvest, and the Wampanoag people attended partly as a political alliance and partly because they arrived armed, responding to gunfire they mistook for preparation of war. Relations between settlers and Native Americans soon turned violent as disease, land seizures, and warfare devastated indigenous populations. The myth of Thanksgiving as a peaceful moment persists because it serves as a national origin story, emphasizing unity and gratitude while glossing over conflict and colonization. The reality is more sobering, a fleeting moment of coexistence, overshadowed by centuries of struggle.
21. The Spanish Inquisition executed millions. When people hear Spanish Inquisition, they often imagine a horrifying institution that burned millions of people at the stake. The reality, while still brutal, was far less exaggerated. Established in 1478 by Ferdinand and Isabella, the Inquisition aimed to enforce Catholic orthodoxy in Spain, particularly among converted Jews and Muslims suspected of secretly practicing their old faiths. But the death toll was nowhere near the millions often claimed. Historians estimate that over its 350-year existence, around 3,000 to 5,000 people were executed. That is still tragic, but not the apocalyptic genocide people picture. Most accused faced punishments like fines, imprisonment, or wearing humiliating garments. The myth of millions killed largely emerged from anti-Spanish propaganda in Protestant Europe. Pamphlets and engravings circulated in the 16th and 17th centuries painted Spain as a land of endless cruelty, exaggerating the Inquisition's horrors for political gain. Later, writers in the 19th century embraced the myth to attack the Catholic Church. The truth is complex. The Inquisition was a powerful tool of fear and repression, but its actual scale was far smaller than legend. By examining court records and official documents, historians have been able to dismantle centuries of exaggeration. The Spanish Inquisition is a reminder of how history can be reshaped into propaganda. A system that was already cruel didn't need embellishment, but myths of millions dead proved too effective to resist. The real lesson is not the inflated numbers, but how fear, faith, and political ambition can twist justice into persecution. 23. The pyramids were built by slaves. For centuries, people have believed that Egypt's mighty pyramids were built by armies of slaves, toiling under the whips of cruel overseers. Hollywood films and biblical stories reinforced this image. Yet archaeology tells a different story. Excavations near the pyramids of Giza have revealed workers' villages, complete with bakeries, breweries, and medical facilities. These findings suggest that the laborers were not slaves, but paid workers, many of whom were skilled craftsmen. Evidence shows they rotated in and out of work crews, possibly as a part of a labor tax system. They ate meat and bread, received medical care, and were buried with honor near the pyramids they helped construct. This myth reduces one of humanity's greatest engineering feats to a story of forced labor. The reality of organized labor, logistics, and national pride shows ancient Egypt in a far more advanced light. Far from slave-built monuments, the pyramids stand as symbols of coordination, culture, and devotion to the pharaohs.
24. The Middle Ages were filthy and no one bathed. Popular culture paints medieval Europe as a land of filth, peasants caked in mud, nobles who never bathed, and streets overflowing with waste. While sanitation was far from modern standards, this picture is an exaggeration. Records and archaeological evidence show that medieval people cared deeply about cleanliness. Public bathhouses were common in towns across Europe, where men and women bathed regularly. Nobles had private tubs, sometimes even heated. Soap making was an established craft, and recipes for perfumes and deodorants survive in manuscripts. Yes, conditions could be unsanitary, especially in crowded cities, The Black Death spread partly due to poor hygiene and rat infestations. But it is a myth to claim people never bathed. Many bathed weekly or monthly, far more often than stereotypes suggest. In fact, the decline of public bathing in Europe came later, during the Renaissance and Reformation, when fears of disease and morality campaigns shuttered bathhouses. The myth of dirty medievals likely arose during the Enlightenment, when intellectuals contrasted their own civilized age with a supposedly barbaric past. Victorian writers further exaggerated it. The Middle Ages were dirty at times, but not universally. People valued cleanliness, used soap, bathed in rivers, and built public baths. It was a different standard than today, but far from the cartoon image of people who never washed. 25. People in the past all married young. It's often assumed that in pre-modern times, people married as teenagers. Many believe marrying at 13 or 14 was the norm, but historical records show this was not typical for most people. In medieval and early modern Europe, the average age of first marriage was surprisingly late, often in the mid-20s for women and late 20s for men. Marriage was not just a personal decision. It was a social and economic arrangement. People waited until they could afford to establish a household. There were exceptions. Noble families sometimes arranged very young marriages for political reasons, though consummation often happened later. Peasant families might marry off children earlier during times of crisis. But across Europe, data from parish registers shows the majority married much later than myths suggest. The idea of universal child marriage in history stems partly from isolated elite examples and from modern readers misinterpreting documents. It also reflects nostalgia for a simpler past or efforts to dramatize how different life used to be. The truth is more familiar. People delayed marriage until they were ready, just like many do today. Average lifespans may have been shorter, but marrying young was not the universal rule people believe. 26. The signing of the Declaration of Independence happened on July 4, 1776. Every July 4th, Americans celebrate Independence Day as the anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Yet the document was not actually signed on that date. The Continental Congress voted for independence on July 2, 1776. The final text of the Declaration was approved on July 4th, but most delegates didn't sign it that day. The majority of signatures were added on August 2, with some delegates signing even later. John Adams, one of the leading voices for independence, believed July 2 would be remembered as the great anniversary. In letters, he described it as the true day of independence. History, however, settled on July 4th, the date printed on the Declaration's copies. The myth of a single dramatic signing on July 4th endures because it simplifies the messy reality of politics. A long process of debate, drafting, and delayed signatures doesn't fit the image of a united, decisive moment. In truth, American independence was gradual and complex. The July 4th signing is a myth that turns a political process into a dramatic scene. Easier to celebrate, but less historically accurate.
27. Medieval torture devices like the Iron Maiden were widely used. The Iron Maiden, a tall, coffin-like device lined with spikes that impaled victims when closed, is one of the most infamous symbols of medieval cruelty. Alongside it, devices like the rack, the pair of anglish, and spiked chairs fill popular imagination with visions of endless torture chambers. But many of these contraptions are myths or later inventions. The Iron Maiden in particular was not a medieval device at all. The first mention of it appears in the late 18th and 19th centuries, when sensationalist writers and museum curators displayed reconstructed medieval torture devices to shock audiences. Many of these were cobbled together from unrelated artifacts and given gruesome backstories. That's not to say torture didn't exist in the Middle Ages.
Authorities used harsh methods such as stretching on the rack, thumb screws, or boiling. But these practices were usually rare, legally regulated, and far less theatrical than myths suggest. Executions and punishments were often public, but the elaborate torture chambers we imagine were mostly inventions of later centuries. The myth of widespread medieval torture devices grew out of Enlightenment and Victorian writers portraying the Middle Ages as a dark and barbaric era. Exhibitions displayed supposed torture tools to horrify visitors and contrast the progress of modern society against the cruelty of the past. By the 20th century, the Iron Maiden had become a staple of books, films, and even heavy metal band imagery. It symbolized sadistic cruelty, even though it never truly existed as described. The truth is sobering. Medieval justice was often brutal, but it did not involve the spiked coffins or bizarre machines of legend. These inventions say more about later society's fascination with horror than about the Middle Ages themselves.
28. Vikings were savage barbarians with no culture. The stereotype of Vikings as wild, filthy barbarians who raided, raped, and plundered across Europe leaves out half the story. While Viking raids were real and terrifying, Vikings were also traders, explorers, and craftsmen. Archaeological finds reveal a rich culture of art, shipbuilding, and storytelling. They established trade routes stretching from North America to the Middle East. Settlements in places like Iceland and Greenland show organized societies with laws and assemblies. The barbarian image comes largely from their victims. Monks and chroniclers who suffered Viking raids described them in the harshest terms. Later European historians repeated these accounts, ignoring evidence of their sophistication. In truth, Vikings were complex people. Warriors, yes, but also farmers, poets, and lawmakers. The myth of pure savagery robs them of their real achievements in exploration and culture. 29. The American Civil War was only about states' rights. A common myth argues that the Civil War was fought purely over states' rights, with slavery only a side issue. But documents from the time make clear slavery was central. Declarations of secession from southern states explicitly cite the defense of slavery as their cause. Leaders like Alexander Stephens, vice president of the Confederacy, stated that the Confederacy was founded on the principle of white supremacy and the enslavement of black people. States' rights were indeed discussed, but the right in question was the right to own slaves. Without slavery, there would have been no war. The states' rights myth grew after the war, promoted by the Lost Cause movement in the South. It softened the image of the Confederacy, allowing veterans and their descendants to frame the conflict as noble rather than as the defense of slavery. Historical records leave no doubt. Slavery was the driving force behind secession and war. To deny it is to accept a comforting myth rather than face the hard truth of America's past. 30. Romans regularly vomited during feasts to keep eating. The image of decadent Romans vomiting between courses to gorge themselves again is one of the most enduring myths about the empire. But it is false. Romans did love lavish banquets, with multiple courses of exotic foods. But the idea of a vomitorium, a special room for purging food, is a misunderstanding. In Latin, vomitorium referred to passageways in amphitheaters that allowed crowds to spew forth quickly, not to dining rooms. No ancient source describes Romans deliberately vomiting to continue eating. While some individuals may have indulged in excess, it was not a cultural practice. The myth likely arose from misinterpretations of Roman texts in the 19th century. Over time, the term vomitorium was twisted into a symbol of Roman decadence. The truth is less grotesque. Romans enjoyed feasts, but there was no institutionalized purging. The vomitorium was about stadium design, not gluttony. This myth persists because it fits the stereotype of Rome as a civilization undone by excess.